to read in Georgian and in English language the great book, A Country on the Verge, The Case for Supporting Georgia, by our greatest friends of Georgia, Ambassador Ian Kelly and David Kramer. And the people are online, and we're going to having a chance to have their live addresses as well. And with this, I open this like a discussion in a hybrid manner during the pandemic time. And I would like to ask Ambassador Shota Guineria to moderate this discussion. And also, we would like to ask you to also ask the questions to our dear authors of this greatest book, which is one of the best books about the Georgia. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Nina. Thank you for this introduction and your opening remarks, and for putting all this together, actually. Thank you. I see a lot of friends and all-time colleagues in the room. I'm really happy to be here in person and to be able to communicate with you guys after a while. And as Nino said, I think it's extremely timely to talk about the topic that you see on the screen here, A Country on the Verge. And this is especially true when this is coming from the friends that know Georgia very well, that love Georgia very well. They know all the details about all the problematic aspects. So two experts and good friends of Georgia writing this piece here in this very important milestone moment, I think, is a really important happening, and thank you for joining us for this discussion. So are we ready to start the discussion with the speakers? Okay, great. So I will have now a little challenge of moving myself around and talking to David and Yin and to the audience at the same time, but I will try to do that as skillfully as I can. Neither of our speakers today need any sort of introduction in Georgia, and both of you are well known as great friends and long-standing supporters of Georgia. But I will still introduce David Kramer and Ambassador Yin Kelly, the authors of this very interesting read. And without further delay, let me ask first opening question to both of you. So why do you think this country is on the verge, and what are the three tests that Georgia is going through at this moment, and how does it look from where you sit? I mean, are we doing a good job to promote national interests of our country in these turbulent times when so many things are happening? But we will have a chance to discuss the specific events a little bit later on. So I will stop here, and I will ask David maybe to start, and then Ambassador Kelly.
Shota, thanks very much, and huge thanks to you, but especially to our dear friend Nino and EPRC, without whom this report would not have been possible. And a thanks also to the German Marshall Fund of the United States, who also played a key role in producing this report initially in English. But huge thanks to Nino, who is really just one of Georgia's greatest. And so Ian and I are very grateful to her, to you, Shota, and to everyone at EPRC, and to everyone there in the audience. We are very sorry we're not there. It looks like you're having refreshments too, so that makes us especially sad that we are not there. But we can't wait to be back in Tbilisi to see everyone in person. So a huge thanks, I think, on behalf of both of us here. We did this report because, as you said, Shota, and Nino as well, we are two in Chicago, I'm in Miami. are living in a country that has been experiencing its own problems and challenges. And so any of the United States and its fellow G7 members to provide shots around the world, I certainly hope will include Georgia. I think here the Europeans and Americans should be doing more to help Georgia. In this situation. Because obviously we want to see the suffering from this terrible pandemic end around the world, but in particular with our friends and allies. The third test that we had cited was the ongoing situation in Nagorno-Karabakh, which we are concerned could flare up again. It certainly posed a challenge for Georgia last fall. And it enabled both Russia and Turkey to increase its role and profile in the region. Russia now, with troops in all three countries, of course, not welcome in Georgia, but now in the Nagorno-Karabakh region, and Turkey with troops in the region for the first time in a century. And so that raises concerns. And we, the United States, did not seem to be an active player at all, or not just an active player, a player at all, in helping to try to produce a ceasefire and a sustainable agreement. Armenia, of course, has elections coming up very soon. And I know there was just a release of...
to welcome us, and we hope we can have a good dialogue here. I have been, I think, particularly nostalgic, really, about Georgia the last few months. Been thinking a lot about my first trip there when I was a young lad in 1976. My first memory was coming in from the airport along the river and seeing those really spectacular cliffs with the buildings that seemed ready to tumble off the cliffs. And then there was that dramatic church kind of at the end of the cliffs, the Meteki Church. And I remember my first weekend in Tbilisi, when I first arrived in September in, when was it, 2015, I guess. And I was talking to a Georgian, we were looking out from that platform, and this Georgian friend said, if you look closely, you will see within several blocks a Georgian Orthodox church, an Armenian church, a Jewish synagogue, and an Islamic mosque. And I thought, that really captures one of the essences of Georgia, its tolerance of other faiths, other ethnicities, and other points of view. And of course, this is really one of the hallmarks of the idea of the West. And this is one of the reasons why David and I feel so passionately that Georgia's future is in the West. But geography is also very important. And as David said, Georgia is also surrounded by illiberal and even predatory powers. So that's what we mean by a nation on the verge, both in a metaphorical sense of on the verge of fulfilling its destiny, of rejoining the West, but also in a geographical sense on the verge of predatory powers. As we dug into the recent history of Georgia since 1991, I think that we became increasingly concerned by a pattern, a pattern that showed that the country is also vulnerable to reverting to the regional mean of illiberalism, where successive governments had a tendency where the executive branch, instead of adhering to the idea of the concept of balance of powers, would tend to accumulate, to gather as much control over the three branches of government. And this we identified as a real issue for Georgia's future development as a democracy. So, I mean, we saw that Parliament really wasn't fulfilling its role of oversight of the executive. There is a particular problem, probably the bigger problem, is that the judiciary lacks independence to be an independent arbiter of decisions that needed to be made, and we're following political guidance rather than independent objectivity. So that's kind of the bad news. But the good news is that there, outside of governmental institutions, there are institutions which hold government accountable. And we identified, first and foremost, civil society. There is a very strong civil society system of NGOs. And they call out the government and ensure a robust debate. And this is absolutely critical to any democratic system. There's also, I think, at least in relative terms, a strong independent media sector. And that, of course, upholds the idea of freedom of expression. And then finally, there's the Georgian people themselves. And the Georgian people themselves enjoy, I think, freedom of assembly, much more, again, than countries in the region. And they enjoy, especially in relative terms, I think, the freest elections in the post-Soviet space. So Georgia is a nation on the verge, and we're particularly concerned about them being surrounded by illiberal predatory powers. And David and I both believe in the ability of the United States to make a real difference for countries that are in a democratic development stage, which I think Georgia still is. And so we wanted to be sure, with the new administration coming in and new Congress coming in, that Georgia did not slip down in the list of priorities. So that was really our main purpose for writing this monograph. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, very much. And let me come back to you with a quick follow-up question. We have entered these extraordinary times of summits, right? There has been a G7 summit recently that produced communique that discussed basically everything except Georgia. There was Belarus mentioned by name, Ukraine mentioned by name, but there was nothing on Georgia. There is a NATO summit going on. Ukraine and Georgia were not invited to that summit with sort of bureaucratic reasoning, but the main thing is that we're not there. Okay, we understand all the explanations why we're not there, but the fact that matters the most is that we're not there. And then the third summit in Geneva. And I remember when we had another presentation of this report, we were still hoping that this summit would not take place, at least in this uncertain manner, and there would have been real deliverables prepared beforehand, before the two leaders could just sit face to face and start talking about all the problems that are there. So what do you take from it, Ambassador? Where is Georgia in all that? And what could or should we do to be on the agenda of those very important international happenings? Because this is something that can keep us alive, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't read too much into the fact that the G7 statement didn't include Georgia. It did include a couple of crisis points in Europe, Belarus and Ukraine. So in some ways, it's good news that Georgia is not listed in those areas of crisis points. Having said that, it is important, I think, that Georgia and Georgia's friends continue to highlight the position that Georgia is in, to highlight the importance of supporting Georgia the importance of the United States role in particular in ensuring that there are not more inroads, both political inroads and military inroads into Georgia's sovereignty. But that's something that I mean, you do have friends in Washington, particularly in this administration, much more than the previous administration. And so it is important, I think, that at a very early date that Georgia does have a high-level meeting with the Biden administration. I think you're a little hamstrung right now because there's no confirmed assistant secretary for Europe, who would be your natural interlocutor for the State Department. But I think Georgia has got some work to do as well. I don't think that you can just count on Washington, which is distracted by a lot of crises, that Washington will continue to place a high priority on Georgia. You need, I think, really to step up your diplomatic game, not just in Washington, but in Brussels as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And David, we of course would love to hear your opinion on this, but let me try to twist the question a little bit and add some more content, especially because Ambassador mentioned friends and friendships and strategic partnerships, right? And we do appreciate very strong support that we get from the United States, from the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, Turkey. There are many friends, really. But what we witness as a trend today is that when there is a criticism coming from those friends, there has been harsh statements from Congressman Kinzinger and Senators Risch and Shaheen and many, many others. And in response to this, our government was saying that we do have strategic partnership with the United States, and the opinion of a couple of people do not really matter, and that the strategic partnership is somewhere, above all that specific things that we worry about. And then the same for our good friend Žygimantas. And what the Prime Minister recently did was, I guess, the most shameful thing that I have witnessed from such a high-level leader, and he named him as jokingly Gijimantas, which would mean a madman in Georgia. And then what was the most important thing, he mentioned the visit of President Nauseda, which was really a very important visit and a demonstration of political support, as sort of the only important thing in Georgian-Lithuanian relationships, and he kind of washed this Žygimantas away by the fact that officially, on the official level, through diplomatic channels, this sort of strategic partnership in the stars, it's still there. That's why people like Žygimantas, they don't really matter. So what is the thin line between the strategic partnership and actionable help and support on the ground, and how we should make sure that the strategic partnership actually works for the benefit of both countries? David.
Well, Shota, let me say this, that the criticisms that have been voiced by members of Congress, by members of other countries' parliaments, by analysts like Ian and me, are done because we care about the country. And are concerned about where the country has been headed in the recent past. And it would be a mistake, I think, to dismiss or write off the criticisms that are voiced. Members of Congress who follow Georgia care deeply about it, and it is bipartisan. There aren't a lot of things that are bipartisan in the United States these days, but support for Georgia is one of them. And we have heard members of Congress talk about conditioning U.S. assistance, and there's been more than $4 billion in military and non-military assistance to Georgia in the past several decades, conditioning assistance on the country's dealing with the problems that it's been wrestling with. Zvigas Pavlonis, who's been a longtime friend of Georgia's and of mine personally, is a passionate defender of freedom and human rights. And it would be a terrible mistake to dismiss him as someone unimportant or someone who is biased. He cares about the country. He wants to see Georgia succeed. I'll let him speak for himself whenever he's able to, but just since you invoked his name as a longtime friend of his, I definitely want to defend what he's done. And I think what he did was very brave in trying to facilitate a compromise between the Georgian dream and the opposition. And I think that Georgians should understand that we do recognize and appreciate the contributions that Georgia has made on a number of different levels. Georgian troops have partnered with the U.S. military in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere, demonstrating Georgia's commitment to being net contributors to international security. And Georgia has answered nearly every call from both NATO and the EU, despite not yet being a member in either, to serve in peacekeeping and or combat missions. And Georgians have served without caveats, side by side with U.S. troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. And Georgia continues to provide significant support to NATO's operations and missions in Afghanistan and Operation Sea Guardian, and contributes to the NATO response force. So, and there have been some 36 Georgians who have paid the ultimate sacrifice in participating in these missions. So we recognize and greatly appreciate the contributions Georgia has made. Georgia is the most pro-Western country in the region. It's the most pro-American country in the region. And that last point underscores why it's so important for the United States to stay heavily engaged in Georgia, to try to do what it can, recognizing that Georgia's future is going to be decided by Georgians, not by Americans. But when our friends, whether in Georgia or elsewhere, stray from the democratic path and do some things that might jeopardize the country's trajectory, then I think it's our obligation, whether we're sitting in Washington, Miami, Chicago, or Vilnius or Brussels, to speak out as friends of the country and to say, we're worried about where you're going. Please do what you can right away to get back on the right path. And I think that's what all of us have been trying to do. Some of us have used some pretty strong language and have indicated that there were certain steps that should have been considered if Georgia continued down the path it was on. I'm glad now, I hope, that those steps won't be needed, but understand that we're not taking our eyes off of Georgia. We're still going to follow it very closely. And if things again go down the wrong path, we'll speak out about it. Hopefully in the next time in person in Tbilisi rather than virtually or remotely.
Okay, thank you, David. Thank you so much. And as I mentioned in the beginning of this event, I see so many good friends and old-time colleagues here that I will not take any more of time here. I will not abuse my privilege of the moderator, and I will now open the floor to the audience for the questions. So I see first hand here from Batu, which is not surprising to anybody, I guess. But Batu, please go ahead.
David, yeah, thank you for your great report. It's much appreciated. It's very sharp and also gives quite a good description of the trajectory Georgia went through since the regaining independence. Though this trajectory is not natural and might require, and that history showed that US quite often gave us the hand of support when we were on the verge, numerous times in our recent history. Now we can debate whether Georgia is on the verge or already on a free fall, but in any case, it's an important component to Georgia's democratic statecraft in the future is support, external support, US support, but also Georgia identifying its geopolitical role, whether it's in the Black Sea, whether it's a strategic interest of the NATO allies on the Black Sea. So there is a quite wide avenue and opportunities because of the recently quite dramatically changed landscape. You both been in a position to advise top US policy makers. So on the eve of the Putin-Biden meeting, what would be your suggestion to President Biden? How to tackle our regional issues? And of course, I would be happy to hear Georgia as a part of the problem between the US and Russia, which unfortunately, Georgian current government declared their goal to remove from the table. So their declared intention was and is that Georgia should not be part of the problem between US and Russia. Georgia was the first one, as you rightly identified in your report, of the first indication of Russia's aggressive revisionism. So what would be your advice and suggestion to the US President? Thank you.
Well, Batu, it's wonderful to hear you and see you, and I hope we have a chance to get together in person very, very soon. I think that in terms of Georgia's relationship with Russia and with the West, when you identified one of the areas, I think, where Georgia can make a real positive contribution to the security of the alliance, given recent events in the Black Sea and attempts by Russia really to turn the Black Sea into a Russian lake with the closing of the Sea of Azov and all the aggressive naval maneuvers and maneuvers of their Air Force against NATO ships in the Black Sea. So I would say that that's one area I think that Georgia should try to expand on, being a net contributor to the alliance in terms of its security in the Black Sea, which really is a great concern, I think, of the Pentagon. On the issue of Russian aggression, of course, the United States itself has been a victim of Russian aggression when it comes to malign influence, and I would hope that the president, when he raises this issue, which I think will be one of the top issues that he raises, that this is a concern not just in the bilateral relationship, although it's an important issue in our bilateral relationship, but this is an issue of concern really for most of Europe and most specifically Georgia and Ukraine. So I would hope that he would expand the, open the aperture of our view on this issue to include vulnerable countries like Georgia. And then just finally to assert that we are not going to close the door on aspirant countries that want to join the alliance. And we also are going to support those countries that have made sovereign decisions about their defense posture, and that we are going to continue with programs like the U.S. Army's Train and Equip program. I think it's important to continue that and expand that, especially as we draw down the U.S. Marines joint training program with the Georgian military as we leave Afghanistan. But again, it's important that Georgia, that the Georgian diplomacy highlights this as well, and not only to say that we're, as always, as David has said, always ready to contribute to the alliance's security, but that they're willing to move into new areas like Black Sea security, So these are, I think, these are important points that you raise, and thanks for giving us an opportunity to talk about it.
Thank
And
you.
Batu, I guess I would just add, first, it is great to see you, unfortunately remotely, but thanks for being here and being there always. I was pleased to see that the Georgian Parliament issued a statement supporting Georgia's integration into NATO, so that was a good sign. I hope today, and I haven't seen anything come out yet from the meeting in Brussels, I hope NATO will reaffirm its commitment to Ukraine's and Georgia's membership in NATO. I realize to a Georgian audience that might sound a little hollow since this was originally pledged in 2008, and here we are 13 years later with not a great deal to show for it. But it is important for NATO to reaffirm its open door policy and its commitment to the membership of your country and of Ukraine. And that's a signal, obviously, to you there in Tbilisi, to Ukrainians in their country, but also to Mr. Putin before his meeting with President Biden. Ian and I were talking before we started today. It was a good decision, I think, of the White House to not do a joint press conference with President Putin. I think and hope that that suggests that President Biden will be delivering a pretty tough message to President Putin, and that, in my view, is the way it should be. I frankly wish this meeting weren't happening. It is, and there are ways, I think, for President Biden to make the best of it, and that is to leave Mr. Putin with no doubts about U.S. commitment to its friends and allies in the region. And as Ian said, and about the attacks that we have been facing here in the United States, hacking and ransomware attacks, that we aren't going to put up with this anymore. Nor should we put up with Mr. Putin's trampling of human rights of Russian citizens. Because the way a regime treats its own people is indicative of how it will behave in foreign policy. And so if we impose penalties and costs on the regime for the way it treats not just Alexei Navalny, but many, many others, then I think it also might have an impact on how Mr. Putin views his relations with countries like yours. So let's see what happens on Wednesday, and we're happy to exchange emails and thoughts on that afterward.
Okay, very good. So other questions? Yeah, Ambassador Badridze up there. Yeah.
Hello. First of all, thank you very much for this publication. I'm looking forward to reading it. And for your continuous support and friendship with Georgia. My question is also regarding the membership prospects, and the barriers that Georgia faces come in three different dimensions. One is Georgia itself, and I just a couple of days ago published a short piece describing in very critical terms what the problem is on Georgia's side. The other one is, of course, Russia's opposition, which is disingenuous, by the way, claiming that NATO enlargement threatens Russia's security is simply a hoax. Russia knows very clearly that the only thing that changes with NATO enlargement is that this limits Russia's ability to bully and invade those countries which join NATO, and NATO membership does not represent necessarily a threat. NATO members do not have the kind of, they are not obliged, for instance, to spread NATO or US weaponry. This could happen, by the way, on a bilateral platform. But the third barrier, in my view, and probably the most real, and the one that we do not speak enough about it, is exactly what happened in 2008, German veto, and the position of those European countries which, again, probably base their opposition more on their bilateral relations with Russia and not on Georgia's conduct, Georgia's readiness, or NATO's own interests. What can the United States tell those partners that actually advance their interests in their bilateral commercial relations with Russia we should not also forget how many politicians now from Western Europe have jumped onto the payrolls of Gazprom, Rosneft, and others. Is there something the United States needs to tell its European partners on this particular regard? Because we understand that even if we had met more criteria that we should, there would be an opposition in Berlin and maybe other capitals as well.
Well, it's great to see you, Ambassador, and it's always great to hear your perspective. You have such great insight, I think, to the dynamics of this important issue. I think that it's important that we all recognize that while we have to continue to say that the door is open, I think we have to recognize that we're dealing with a leader of Russia who is willing to use military force, not only to prevent countries from joining NATO, but also, as we saw in Ukraine, quite obviously, from them getting closer to the EU. So I think that we need to tell our European allies that this principle is important. The open door principle is important, but it's also very important to deter and contain, to use an old diplomatic term that I grew up with, an aggressive, predatory power like Russia. And I think that's why we need to do things like provide Ukraine and Georgia with top of the line weaponry like the Javelin missiles, to make quite clear that we value our partnership with Georgia, that Georgia has the sovereign right to have the means to defend its territory from further predation, from further expansion of Russia into Georgian territory. But I also think that we need to explain to Europe that we don't agree that they should expand their dependency on Russian petrocarbons. And at the same time, we need to help countries like Ukraine and Georgia defend themselves. But the big factor here, of course, is the Putin factor. And I totally agree with you that Russia is actually safer in its western borders than it's ever been. It's ironic that they identify the West as its #1 adversary, the West in the guise of NATO. But there is no real threat of any kind of attack from the West. The real threats in terms of challenges to their sovereignty comes from their southern borders. And I think, American diplomats, including myself, have really talked till we're blue in the face that they have nothing to fear from NATO. I'm not sure there's too much more we can do to try and knock down that myth that they're propagating, that they need to respond to NATO challenges and threats. And I'll hand it over to David. Go ahead, David.
Sure. No, Ambassador, thank you very much for that very insightful question. I guess the only thing I would add are there are a few things to keep an eye on. One is Chancellor Merkel is scheduled to visit Washington July 15th. And in my view, she and the German government have some repair work to do. And that is because of their relentless push to complete the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which I think is a terrible decision on the part of the German government. And so that might make her, in her waning months, a little more open to consider what Germany could do to help countries in the region offset the pain that will be inflicted as a result of that pipeline if it is completed. Second, President Zelensky is supposed to visit Washington, I think after Chancellor Merkel's visit later in July. And as you know, the Ukraine and President Zelensky have really been making a strong push for MAP and membership. There is a caution, I would add, which is be careful about forcing a decision before you know you're going to get a positive decision. If you force NATO to make a decision on your membership now, the answer will be no, because there is not consensus, unfortunately. But if you do what is necessary, stay on the right democratic path, continue what Georgia has been doing and contributing to various peacekeeping operations around the world, it becomes harder for the United States and NATO allies to say no. And we have to make it clear, and I think this is a key point, that Russian occupation of another nation should not automatically disqualify that nation from NATO membership. Otherwise, we actually encourage Russia to occupy their neighbor's territory. And so we can be creative in the ways that we work around this for both Ukraine and Georgia. This is the issue, I think, that perhaps scares our European allies more than anything. And it's a serious debate to be had, but it can be had, and there can be ways to work around it. But at the end of the day, we have to be crystal clear that Moscow does not have a de facto veto over other countries' aspirations to join either NATO or the EU. It wasn't until 2013 that the EU also became this bogeyman for the Kremlin, with pressure on Armenia, Moldova, and Ukraine. And the Moldovans still went ahead. Of course, Yanukovych made his fatal decision to reverse his plans to sign, and Armenia quietly did back up, but eventually came back around. So, as Ian rightly said, Russia's most secure, stable borders are in the West, with countries that are members of the European Union and or NATO. Its biggest threats and challenges are to the south and east. And unless and until Moscow comes to deal with that, then it's going to continue to create this phony threat that it sees from us.
Thank you, David, very much. We have time for a couple of more questions, but since you touched upon this topic of membership in the context of occupied territories, I cannot help myself but to mention Luke Coffey's great report that came out a couple of days ago, and everybody who is watching Georgia's NATO integration process knows Luke's ideas, bold and let's say out-of-the-box ideas, how to move ahead very difficult political problems pertaining Georgia's NATO membership. And he has this loud title there in his report, which says, "Time to end Russia's veto on Georgia's NATO membership." And basically he proposes a couple of solutions, such as discussing the possibility of Georgia joining NATO, of course, in its internationally recognized borders, but Article 5 only covering the territories which are at this moment controlled by the central government of Georgia. Everybody knows that these are very tricky, dangerous, it's a landmine, and many different things can happen there while we're talking about all that. But we also know that it's inevitable to have a substantial discussion on these topics, and without having answers to those topics, it is really simply not possible to move ahead and take real and tangible steps towards NATO membership. So that was my 2 cents to this. But back to the audience now. Are there any other questions? Nino, do you have the mic? Do we have the mic? Gigi?
Hello, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Kelly. This is Nino Gelashvili from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, with my boring questions. Another one. So the communique is published of the NATO summit, which says that Georgia will become a member of the alliance with the membership action plan as an integral part of the process. Do you think the emphasizing of the MAP necessity as a necessary step, necessary stage on the way to the NATO for Georgia, it's kind of giving a guaranteed time or years, I don't know, to Russia, because it will take time to reach the membership action plan, to fulfill it, and so we are talking about, as I guess, at least about several years, I don't know, maybe 5, 10, how many, who knows. Thank you. What would you say? What does this emphasize mean?
Well, thank you, Nino, for that question. I, of course, have not seen the declaration yet, but the language you just gave is exactly the language of the Bucharest summit, and I think that line with MAP being an integral part of the process was the price that many of Georgia's supporters in NATO had to pay to get some of the Central European countries on board, because I think that there is nothing in the North Atlantic Treaty that says that a country has to have a membership action plan. And in fact, that is, to have a membership action plan is to invite, for however long that period lasts, as you say, it's usually years, invite a lot of, to put it mildly, mischief in that period from Russia. I think the much better way to do this would be to, as Lou Coffey said, to come up with some kind of language about the occupied territories not being subject to Article 5 protection without giving up the Georgia's goal of regaining its territorial integrity and its international borders. There's precedent for this. That's the way West Germany got in. The government in Bonn did not give up their goal of reuniting the territories of Georgia, but did, for the purposes of their NATO membership, give up Article 5 protection for part of their territory, East Germany. Yeah, I have to say, I'm not real happy with that language, MAP being an integral part of the process, because I think it's just it's a guarantee of failure of moving forward on membership for Georgia. Yeah, I'll have to see the whole declaration, but yeah, I'm sorry to see that language reinserted. It's not the most politically courageous language that I could have imagined anyway.
Yeah, and I'll just add, Nino, thank you for the question, not boring at all. But I would say that I agree with Ian's assessment. For quite a few years, I have felt a MAP actually would not necessarily be a real positive big step forward. That said, what I would say is the Georgian government and the various political parties in the parliament need to seize on this language, pursue a MAP as soon as possible, and get the process moving. Make it hard for us to say no. And one way to do that, by the way, and this is why one of the reasons we wrote the report, is to make sure you stay on the right political path toward democracy. Because any excuse that various political players can give to those who are sitting on the fence, who aren't certain they want Georgia in or not, any excuse you give them is a further delay in the process. Make it impossible for us to say no. And so that means continuing democratic development, and continuing pursuit of Euro-Atlantic integration and dealing with reform in the judiciary and the election process and so on. But I agree, it's not great language, but make the best of it, because that's the language that there is apparently. And then work with the United States as the most influential member of NATO, but not as one that has the ability to boss other countries around. As we saw in 2008, President Bush sought to get a membership action plan for Ukraine and Georgia and failed. And the language that emerged was the alternative that he and Chancellor Merkel agreed upon. But it is a reminder that the United States, while the most influential, does not have the final say. But work with us, and I'm sure we will work with you in moving forward on this process.
Yeah, and unfortunately this language was expected because there was a telephone conversation between President Biden and President Zelensky a couple of days ago, and the readout of the meeting explicitly said that the best thing that Georgia and Ukraine could hope for as a result of this summit is the deterioration of the Bucharest summit language, and this is exactly what we see there. But there are some more questions in the audience, please.
Hello, I'm George Darcia, representing USAID's economic growth team. Thank you for inviting me. I have a question to His Excellency Mr. Jan Kelly. While we all know that our way to NATO membership is so difficult and painful, meanwhile, I'm sure all of us would love to hear your suggestion about what practical mechanisms we can use to guarantee that Russia's aggressive borderization is prevented. Thank you.
Ian, you went on mute. There you go.
Yeah, I know.
You're right.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for that question, and thank you for all your great work with USAID. And I was always a real big believer in the importance of economic development for Georgia. I was always a big supporter of free trade agreement. I was not successful in arguing for starting free trade agreement talks with between Washington and Tbilisi. But I think that is the real guarantee against further Russian expansion into Georgian territory, and that's to have a successful, prosperous, and resilient state. And of course, an important part of that is to have a virtuous counter model to what we see going on in the regions, which is those regions are entirely dependent on subsidies from Moscow. And I think really for the best way for Georgia in a peaceful way to regain its territorial integrity is to have a prosperous and resilient state. There are some things I think that Georgia has to do to enable that kind of economic growth, and I think that one of those areas is with further foreign direct investment, and I'm afraid that one of the real obstacles for increased investment is the reluctance of investors to invest in a country where there is a perception that they're not necessarily going to get their day in court and have their investments really guaranteed because of the perception of political manipulation of court decisions. So I mean that's an important part, I think, also of Georgia's economic development, is development of a truly independent judiciary where investors can feel confident that their investments will be protected and not expropriated. And unfortunately, in my time there were several examples of court decisions that had the effect of expropriation.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? Yep, another question there in the middle, please. David, do you want to add something to the borderization issue? Meanwhile, okay, so please, go ahead.
Mr. David, Mr. Yan, thank you for the given opportunity. I'm Tamar Chikwiladze from Tavari channel. We've done a couple of interviews in the past. Talking about the foreign investments, my remark is that we are below some, I don't know, the marks that haven't been here since 2009. So it's been like 16 years that we have international investments below everything. To go back to what I wanted to say, it's more like a remark rather than a question, I guess, but talking about the country on the verge, and I understand it's a geographical thing, but we are still on the verge in this polarized country, and talking about the saddening news about MAP and talking about the government that we have here who doesn't have any kind of political will to, I don't know, hear from you, to hear from the West. What do you think could be the turnover point, to say so, that would attract more attention from the West and that would make kind of alarming messages? Because unless that, here people don't hear in the government whatever is said. Here in Georgia, among the civil society, among, I don't know, our Western good friends and allies, including you, so they don't want to hear. So what could that be that would alarm the Western world from here in Georgia? Thank you.
David, do you want to start first? Well, I think that Georgia, I think, really has got to take the initiative, and you know, one of the I think one of the challenges is going to be that the keystone, really, of Georgia's contribution to NATO in a very real way in terms of blood and treasure was the security that they provided for the main NATO air base, Bagram Air Base, and that keystone effort is going away. So I think that Georgia really has to take the initiative. We've talked about the Black Sea as being a real opportunity for Georgia to make a real net contribution to security. I know that NATO countries are very concerned about the recent developments around Ukraine and the Sea of Azov, and you know, all of the interference that we've seen of naval missions in the Black Sea. So I would urge the Georgian government to seize that initiative. And of course, you know, Georgia has some very strong partners in the Black Sea littoral with Bulgaria, Romania, and Turkey. So that would be my recommendation, to try and do more for Black Sea security. Take the lead. You know, why not take the lead in it?
And I guess I would just add that, as we said at the outset, the United States has its hands full internally and with foreign policy challenges. And one of those challenges is very close to Georgia, and that is the Putin regime. But Georgia came sort of on the radar screen of the United States after the Rose Revolution in 2003, and then its pursuit of a democratic path with some issues and problems, to be clear, and its interest in integrating more closely in the Euro-Atlantic community. And then President Saakashvili developed a very close relationship with President Bush. Some would criticize and say it was over-personalized. But in the Obama administration, there was distance. There was not the same kind of relationship. In the Trump administration, you had two visits, one by Vice President Pence in 2017 and one, I think, a very ill-advised trip by Secretary Pompeo last November. But so far there haven't been any visits. I hope that will change. But given all the problems that the United States has on its radar screen, if Georgia can stand out by succeeding, by doing well, by doing right, if Georgia has problems, runs into another political crisis, whatever the case may be, the United States will have other issues it can deal with. And none of us wants to see that. There needs to be a strong U.S.-Georgian relationship in order to help Georgia, but a strong, vibrant, democratic Georgia is also a tremendous help to the United States. It's mutually beneficial. And so we want to see Georgia succeed, and by that I would include developing a strong U.S.-Georgian relationship. And to do that, it means staying on a democratic path and dealing with the various issues that need to be reformed in a serious way and do it quickly. Pursue a map if that is unfortunately the option that is left in order to continue toward deeper Euro-Atlantic integration. It's vital. The United States has a critical role to play in that, but Georgia also has its part to do as well.
Yep, absolutely, and I think this is a great point to sum up and to kind of round up our discussion today, because everybody in this room and beyond understand that foreign policy is not a narrative. It doesn't really matter what you say unless what you say in the policy is actually supported by the actions on the ground. And we have seen that the government of Georgia was not really active in foreign arena in general and in NATO integration in particular, and that's why we do have that, let's say, stagnation in the political process of Georgia's NATO integration. That's why we're not surprised that we got only the same wording from the Bucharest summit decision in the NATO summit today. We were not invited there. And, you know, if you look at the news today in Georgia, you will see that many Georgian policymakers have been put in defensive mode, you know, by the journalists, by the civil society representatives, by experts, and they were asking these questions, you know, could we get more from the summit? Why didn't we get at least anything specific from the summit? And then the answer was, you know what? We have done actually everything that NATO was requesting from us. And this is a best proof that the policy-making process here in Georgia is going in the wrong direction, because it's not about what NATO is requesting from you. It's not about formal criteria. It's about the strong political will to use help and support by our friends and allies and partners, such as we have on the screen here, and thankfully many others. This is not about exchanging the diplomatic statements only, and this is not having that strategic partnerships on the paper, but this is to prove time and again that we are reliable partners. We're moving ahead with all those criteria that we need to achieve for joining NATO and not being stagnated at one point or even backsliding in many cases. So this is what it is. We understand we have a lot of problems, but again, to end on the positive note, we do have a lot of friends, we do have a lot of support, a lot of people that care about Georgia, and then we should capitalize on that and make sure that this support is translated and reflected in specific policies, and it delivers specific results on Georgia's foreign policy front. So if there is any final notes that both speakers wanted to make, then it's time to do it now. And then we will finalize the meeting.
Well, Shota, I would just say huge thanks to you, to Nino, to EPRC, and to everyone there in attendance. Again, Ian and I wish we were there in person. It would be a lot more enjoyable. But we look forward to that day coming soon, we hope, and to doing what we can, on the margins, certainly, to help.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate my thanks to Nino and Shota and to all of you. That was a really interesting debate for me. I hope it was for you as well. And I guess just to close, just to say next time in Tbilisi.
Yep, thank you very much. Thank you to both authors. Special thanks to our own Zaza Shengelia, who translated this beautiful book into Georgian language. And thanks to Nino and the whole EPRC team for giving us this floor for the wonderful discussions. Next time in Tbilisi, Ambassador, indeed.
Thanks to the Stamba Hotel. We hope to be there soon.
Oh, absolutely. Bye-bye.
Bye.